Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Muthuraman Annamalai. I'm the section chair for the ASQ Charlotte section. We are very excited to have this webinar on problem solving by David Auda. I want to introduce our speaker, David, today. So David is a senior safety reliability engineer who has over 40 years of interdisciplinary experience in a variety of industries like the aerospace, sensitized goods manufacturing, instrument development, energy, medical devices, automotive, and heavy equipment. David is an ASQ certified reliability engineer as well as the certified quality manager for organizational excellence. He has an honors graduate from RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology, with an undergraduate Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering and a master's level study in applied statistics and reliability. David is an ASQ validated trainer and a volunteer leader. He has served as the past chair for the ASQ reliability division, and he has developed the 16-hour problem solving, root cause analysis, evidence-based analysis course to train facilitators, from which this webinar material is derived. Please help me welcome David Auda.
Okay, so I do have a poll that I wanted to run just so that I could get a better idea of who's doing what. So let me launch the poll and give you an opportunity to respond to it. So I'm asking if you're a facilitator of these following RCA tools. Have you done Kepner-Trigo, Taproot, SolarLogic, reliability charting, or reality charting rather, and Apollo? I realize that some people probably don't. So I'm trying to figure out who the facilitators are that have had some exposure here. I'm looking at the attendees' response. I'm seeing 13 out of 86, about 18, 20%. Give it a little more time. Maybe we get 50% people voted. It looks like we're going to hang here at about 20%, which is okay. I mean, it gives me some idea of who's in the audience. Let me share the results. Looks like a lot of people are familiar with Kepner-Trigo. Kepner-Trigo is a multi-step process. It has a couple of fanfold sheets that you use and is pretty descriptive in its approach. Taproot, of course, is one of those that's very similar to reality charting and Apollo. I think they've somewhat evolved together. And those are the three major players that I see: Taproot, reality charting, and Apollo. So let's go back to our presentation and talk about motivation. Let me ask some simple questions here. Some months have 30 days, some months have 31 days. How many have 28? Some people may answer that question and say, one, February has 28, but actually the question is somewhat of a trick question because it's basically asking how many months have 28 days. They all have 28 days. It's a different way of looking at the question, right? So as problem solvers, when we have information that comes to us verbally, and we have to interpret that information. And a lot of times we may make a mistake as trivial as something like this. Let's look at another one. Mr. Smith has 4 daughters. Each of his daughters has a brother. How many children does Mr. Smith have? Most people would just respond and say 8. There are 4 daughters. Each one of them has a brother. Well, there's only one brother. And that brother is brother to all 4 daughters. So there's only 5 children, 4 daughters and 1 brother. you can see there's a different way, and you start to get a sense of this shift in perspective, that you have to look at it differently. And problem solving is very much like that. You have to look at it differently. You're constantly trying to gain the alternative perspective. Here's another one. John bets $100 that he can predict the score of a football game before it starts. Tom agrees, and he loses the bet. Why and how did Tom lose the bet? Well, of course, John bets him 100 for the football game, which is 0-0. It's always 0-0 before the game. There is no score. So you see that this what would appear to be a stumbling block on our part. We should be able to answer these reasonably easily, but we have a number of mechanisms that are within us that push us in this particular direction. These heuristics that we use are shortcuts for us to be able to answer these types of questions. And in many cases, they lead us into the wrong direction. And as good problem solvers, we need to be more careful about that. So the motivation, again, is that we tend to interpret things in a very simplistic way when we should really be looking at all the data from every possible perspective. So the motivation here is studies have revealed that 70–80% of the population are less than adequate when it comes to problem solving. Oh, no surprise there. Mistakenly short-term results like the Hawthorne effect are taken to be effective but fail in the long term. They're not sustainable. If you're familiar with the Hawthorne effect, this is when they've done some studies in factories where they went in and they just changed the level of the lighting. They made the lights brighter, and all of a sudden production levels went up. And they went back in and made the lights lower. And again, the production levels changed and went up again. Why did they go up? Well, because they sensed, the production workers sensed that they were being watched. But that's not a sustainable effect. And after a while, it just goes back to where it was and maybe even goes below the previous production level. That's the Hawthorne effect. Studies have also shown that most people, when confronted with complex issues that require decisions, tend to satisfice. And that's a real word, satisfice. It means that we tend to settle for a minimum. So there are levels to decision making, and of course problem solving and root cause analysis is a stepwise progression of decision after decision after decision. And we look at the different levels we can optimize. In other words, if you were going to buy a used car and you wanted to optimize, you'd make a list of everything: what size tires you want, white walls, black walls, you want chrome, aluminum, wheels, what kind of interior you want, color, should the car be 2-door, 4-door, should it have a V8 or a V6 or a straight six? And you make this exhaustive list of things that you want, and you're going to optimize that. But nobody really does that because car shopping doesn't allow you to do that. You pretty much have to go on the betterment progression. In other words, you're looking for a car that's better than the one that you have. So you're going to meet some of the criteria on that list, but not all of it. And then there's satisficing. It has to do with channel capacity, our ability to be able to process information, which requires cognitive energy, and we don't necessarily like to expend cognitive energy as human beings. So this is that situation where you walk on the lot, they don't have the optimum car that you want, they don't even have a car that looks much better than the one you're driving, but because you're just wanting to get it done, you're going to satisfy and you'll take whatever's on the lot. You'll just buy something that's there. A lot of people do that. My wife will do that. We'll go to the store to buy a coffee maker, and we've already decided what it is that we want. We get there, it's not on the shelf, and we don't want to wait for it, so she'll buy whatever's on the shelf. And I'm opposed to that. I have in my mind what it is I want. If I have to order it and wait for it to be delivered, then I'll do that. If I have to go to 2 or 3 more stores, I'll do that. But she would rather satisfy and say, hey, we're here. I don't want to go to another store. I don't want to have to wait for it to come. Let's just buy whatever's here. That's satisfying. There's a note I made here about the 1997 chess game that Garry Kasparov had played against Deep Blue. And after being defeated in the game where his computer opponent adopted a satisfying position, he remarked that the computer was playing like a human. And then he later figured out how to optimize on that. So the idea here is that he was expecting a rational, logical move, but there was a satisfied move that was made. And that sort of threw him off. And that's how the great chess players were beating these computers, was by making irrational moves. So the essential ingredients for problem solving are going to be the observational agility, as we already saw, the viewpoint. So when you're posed with a question, you should look at it as though there's another dimension to it, that you have to look at it from a different perspective. Give yourself that minute to take another look at it. This goes according to everything, right? This is commercials, car sales, pharmaceuticals, doctors, dates, you name it. Everything that gets said should be taken into consideration for an alternative view. Now, that is really a habitual behavioral pattern that needs to be adopted to become a good problem solver. I say that because if you're looking to become a good problem solver, it's not a seasonal thing. It's one of these things where you move into this position, you start to think like a problem solver. I remember once when I was chairing the Society of Reliability Engineers chapter up in Buffalo, New York, I had brought in an expert who was a criminal psychologist, and she was so successful in the work that she had done, learning how to think like a criminal, that she was invited to Scotland Yard and invited into the inner circles of military intelligence to share her findings and her learnings. But after a couple of years, she quit that business. She just couldn't take it anymore because she was constantly thinking like a criminal. And that's somewhat of a perversion of thought. And it was becoming habitual, and she didn't want to do that anymore. So she ended up taking another job somewhere else, doing something much, much more pleasant. But this idea of becoming a good problem solver is one of those things where you learn and you integrate and learn, integrate, learn, integrate, and you become habitual in that type of a process. I say that as a caution and also as a benefit. If you want to be a good problem solver, then you're going to build these habits and you're going to be that person. And you're not going to be able to escape it unless you change all those habits. We'll talk about that a little bit more. There's also this cognitive bandwidth, channel capacity. You're going to have to be able to absorb more information. You're going to have to be more aware of your surroundings, and you're going to have to scrutinize information as it comes in. That requires cognitive energy. You're going to have to spend that energy. So you're going to have to be one of those people who likes to think, and think hard. Decision guidance and maturity is going to be part of this process. To be a good problem solver, you need to make good decisions, probability and statistics, appreciation. In other words, you don't have to be good at doing probabilistic Bayesian inferential statistics, but you have to be aware of the fact that these elements are counterintuitive in many cases, and you need to have an appreciation of that. And if you're not able to solve those complexities, then you need to go and find someone who can help you. And then you also have to be aware of heuristics and bias management, because we're virtually wired for that. We make thousands and thousands of decisions on a daily basis. And yet, for the most part, we're only cognizant of a handful of those decisions during the course of a day. And then, of course, facilitation skills. If you want to be a good problem solver, this is about leading teams and other individuals, about extracting the information from those experts to be able to do that. In this facilitation skill area is really player versus referee, right? This is the idea of being a player in the game as opposed to being a referee watching the rules. I had coached and managed soccer, and I was also a player for over 20 years. Playing the game was completely different than refereeing the game. When I was playing the game, I was totally immersed. I was not watching for offsides or illegal throws. I was not looking for averting fouls. I was playing the game as best I could and enjoying it as much as I could. But as a referee, it was completely different. I was watching the footsteps of people, watching the body motion of people. I couldn't appreciate the game at all. I was watching the game from a rules perspective. Facilitation skills is sort of straddling that fence of the referee, where you have to watch the rules of the game because you've got a bunch of people in the room, probably international, multicultural people in the room that you're trying to manage into a coherent team to do problem-solving root cause analysis. That requires a variety of skills that we'll talk about a little bit later in this presentation. So here's a clarification, the process of simplification. When we work with engineers, this is the challenge that we have. Information that comes to us in very peculiar ways. Here's an engineer that's simplifying this equation, 1 + 1 = 2. First, he recognizes that 1 is equal to this trigonometric identity of cosine squared x plus sine squared x is equal to 1. He also recognizes that 1 equals the natural log of v, and that 1 over the square root of the natural log of v also equals 1, which is more evident to him as an engineer. So now we have cosine squared x plus 1 over the square root of natural log of e plus the sine squared of x is equivalent to 1 plus 1. Now, he also recognizes from hyperbolic functions that 2 times e raised to the x times 4 times e raised to the minus x divided by 4 equals 2. And that if he takes e as the limit of n going to infinity for 1 plus 1 over n raised to the n, then he can simplify this equation even more, putting this all together. He can show that cosine of squared x plus 1 over the square root of natural log of e plus sine squared x equals 2 times the limit as n goes to infinity for 1 plus 1 over n raised to the n times raised to the x times 4 times e to the minus x divided by 4 is really a simplification of 1 plus 1 equals 2. How many times have you had information come to you in this abstract form when, in fact, it could have came to you in this form? So part of that challenge as a facilitator in problem solving is to take this complexity and simplify it. And this may mean having to force engineers to work backwards through this information to make it simplistic and understandable for the lay person in the room. So we can simplify even more, but we'll stop here. Now, when we look at problems, we're discovering that the problems that we have are becoming much, much more difficult. We have, say, autonomous cars that are crashing, and we've seen several of those in the newspaper recently. And what we've come to appreciate is that problems are no longer simple down here. When we look at the evidence for divergence and the evidence that is available, and down here where the degree of difficulty for causal attribution is relatively simple and deterministic on this axis, what we discover is that it's really easy to find the solution here. It's almost obvious in many cases something failed, something mechanically failed. It's well constrained, it's balanced, the coupling and cohesion are balanced well. And these are effective practices that we apply. We can find this solution using a 5y. It converges easily under analysis. But as we move up along this axis of complexity where hardware, software, algorithms start to include things like decision-making and artificial intelligence, we start to see that things start to get a little more complicated. Now we have governing constraints that we may not be able to surface or may not even be aware of. We've got balanced coupling and cohesion still, but that's not helping us. And we're going to follow practices that are available, whatever those are, and likely convergence under analysis. We're not guaranteed convergence. And as we move further along, we find that complexity grows. Now we start to get a vagueness between where the delineation of hardware and software is. We got hardware people arguing with software people about the problem. It's a hardware problem that failed. No, it's a software problem. It's a semiconductor that flipped a bit. No, it's a software issue. There's a bug that's in the software. Now we've got enabling constraints, and we have loose cohesion and tight coupling between things. We've got emergent practices that are coming out, likely convergence under analysis. And then as we move up, we end up in this idea where we're in this phenomenological domain and things are starting to diverge. The evidence is leading us to multiple paths. We've got chaos. There's no constraints anymore. Loose cohesion, tight coupling, novel practices, and we have phenomenon. So problem solving has now become somewhat of a challenge for even the seasoned engineer who's been doing it for 20 years. Let's talk about facilitation skills, because as a core fundamental practice for a problem solver, facilitation skills are going to be key. So what is a facilitator? It's a service to others, right? The most important job of the facilitator is protect the process. He's using time and space with intent. You know, how should we go about this? What should we do next? Where do we need to go and give? What do we have to get? Where do we stop? Where do we start? And these are all part of that process. Less than 1% of the statements made by low performance group members referred to the process. 99% of their focus was on content of the problem itself. That's a mistake. Facilitator is a protector of the process. The facilitator's toolkit is set of techniques, knowledge, and experience, and these have to be built. So if you want to be a good facilitator, you have to do it over and over again. We help to create that process. We adjust it. We keep it heading in the right direction. And most importantly, keeps people attached to it. The function of the facilitator is to keep the meeting focused and moving. In other words, walk into the room and make progress almost immediately. Facilitator sometimes acts as a resource to the group, can be, depending on the skill level and competence, could be performing some of those tasks. Maintenance roles, essential in team building. Facilitator intervenes to help the group stay focused and build cohesiveness. And also keep the meeting on track. Facilitator must remain aware of the agenda. He's the referee, he's following the rules, keeping things going. So these notes will come to you in the PPS that will be attached that Mutu will set out later. So you can look at those in detail. High-level overview, causal elements, that's where we're going, right? We want to do causal attribution. Necessary condition for causal attribution is going to be good decision-making. This comes from decision theory. So we're going to take a look at decision theory to find out what it is and how do we apply it. And that decisions are also coming from thinking. If we're not thinking, we're not making decisions. We're making choices or we're making judgments. And so thinking is going to be critical to making good decisions. So we have a project perspective. The sum is always greater than the sum of the parts, which basically says that the smartest person in the room is not smarter than the group. So we want to take advantage of the group. That's why we facilitate these problem-solving, causal attribution, root cause analysis is done in a group setting because we're trying to remove the risk or deal with the risk effectively. So let's talk about expected utility theory. This, up until maybe 5 or 6 years ago, was the dominant decision theory. And basically it said that this comes out of game theory. It says seek to know all the possible outcomes, very descriptive in its approach. Descriptive to the extent that it would be able to describe but not prescribe. For instance, tic-tac-toe. There are 255,168 unique combinational plays in tic-tac-toe, and that's excluding symmetry. These describe the game, but not how to win the game. Strategy describes how to win that game. So understanding the strategy for the game means that you'll never lose a game. At worst, you'll come to a draw, but you'll always be able to win the game if your opponent isn't as clever or doesn't know how to play the game as well. So we have a variety of reasons to question the validity of something like expected utility theory. It also seeks to understand and assess risk objectively. This is probabilistic numeracy. And if you've read any of John Allen Paulo's work, notably his book called Innumeracy, what you'll discover is that people are very bad with probability. We don't have time to play around with probability. There might be a slide or two in here that has a question on it, but for the most part, probability is counterintuitive. And so we need to have an awareness of that. We're not going to do that calculation if we're not experienced in that area. We're going to look for somebody to help us do that. Decision weighting is equivalent to the probability weighting. This is an assumption made in expected utility theory. Expected utility theory also says that the best payoff is considered from the alternatives. This is the dominant strategy. And in cases the min-max. When we look at min-max and tic-tac-toe, it basically says that I'll never do anything worse than draw with my opponent. I'll never lose the game. The worst I could possibly do. The maximum min is that I'll draw, and the max is that I'll win. We also display consistency in preferences. This transitivity is a cardinal rule in expected utility theory. And if it's violated, then we violated one of the cardinal rules, and so we can disqualify expected utility theory. It's insensitive to how the demand for the choices originated. In other words, irrationality is not taken into consideration. And the reference point is relative to the total asset position. This is called utility, and we're not taking that into consideration either when we do problem solving. And this expected utility theory has some flaws. For instance, let's look at some preferences. Let's say I give you a 61% chance to win $600, or I give you a 63% chance to win $500. Most people, about 70%, will probably choose the 61% chance to win $600. It's only a 2% difference in probability. So I could win an extra $100 just by playing the 61%. Let me give you another choice. Choose your preference here. 98% chance to win that $600, or I'll give you the $500. Which one would you take? Well, everybody would take the $500, right? So here, you've just violated the cardinal rule of expected utility theory. You've allowed this break in transitivity. In other words, if you took the 61% chance, 63% chance, then you should have taken the 98% chance. You're not transitive in your decision. So you violated that cardinal rule of expected utility theory. And that, again, is the only thing that I did here was add 37 to each of the numbers in order for you to break the rule. And I could show you how to break the other rules in expected utility theory. That's why expected utility theory is no longer the dominant decision theory. Expected utility theory also assumed that your decision weighting was equivalent to your probabilistic weighting. This expected utility is a weighting that is taken in consideration of a variety of different problems depending on where they come from. So if we look at this, what we discover is that for small probabilities, which we just saw, people will tend to be too optimistic. In other words, they'll allow the decision weighting to take preference over the probability weighting. And at the other end, they tend to do the opposite. So if we look at the other side, we tend to be a little risk averse on this side, because as we scope out, what we discover is that the decision is underrated with respect to the probability. And we don't have an opportunity to go through some probabilities. Wish we had more time. Unfortunately, we don't. But the idea here, when I do this presentation in a workshop, we go through a variety of exercises to bring the attendee, the candidate facilitator, into a greater appreciation of probability, so that when somebody does rank something or make a decision or offer a probability, he'll be able to, or he or she will be able to look at that probability with a jaundiced eye. And if they're not convinced, if they can't convince themselves through analysis and calculation, then they'll have to go somewhere to get a second opinion. Peirce prospect theory. This is now the dominant theory in decision theory. Recognizes our information processing limits, takes that into consideration. It also takes into consideration our probabilistic innumeracy. It also takes into consideration our tendency to reduce cognitive effort or to satisfice. Dominated alternatives are not always discarded. This is taken into consideration by anchoring our intransivity, political influence, and also takes into consideration influence of choice framing, inconsistency of decision weighting. Concurrent choices are simplified into separate acts, and our preference for a reference point that is relative or out of context for risk averse. So let me give you another choice here. Let's say in this hedonic editing, which is part of this consideration that's given in prospect theory to help people make better decisions. Let's say that you entered a raffle and you forgot about it and you won $50. So somebody gives you a call and says, hey, you won 50 bucks. You forgot that you even had, because surprise. You get this feeling right away, right? You take that phone call and somebody says, hey, I got 50 bucks for you. That's a nice feeling. And you also get an unexpected check from your auto insurance company, noting that because you're such a great driver, they decided to kick back $25. So you get another 25. The question is, would you rather have these both come on the same day, or would you prefer to have them separated in time? Most people would say that they'd prefer to have them separated in time. It's a good feeling that they'd like to have twice. Let's flip this around a little bit and say that you get a ticket in the mail because you were caught speeding by one of those cameras. You know, the camera doesn't put any points on your license. You don't have to go to court for it because you can't really tell who's driving the car, but they send you a bill for 50 bucks. And you also get an unexpected call from your tax accounting saying he made a mistake and now you got to pay him another 50 bucks because he made a mistake on your return. Would you rather have these both come in the same day, or would you rather have them separated in time? And the answer overwhelmingly is, give it to me now. Pull that tooth out now. I don't want to have to go twice. Most people go to the dentist who have to have extractions would rather have 3 extractions done in one day rather than have one done, have to go back, have another one done, have to go back, have another one done. You start to get this sense of decision-making that needs to be taken into consideration. You have to look at the people who you're working with and understand how it is that this information is coming to them and how they're processing that information. That's part of problem solving. Problems real and perceived. Problems don't have to be real. They can be perceived. Effective decision-making is a necessary condition for successful problem development and subsequent solution investigation. So we need to always be looking at how are we making our decisions. Or how are other people making decisions? How are those decisions coming into the team, and how are they being governed? It's the facilitator's responsibility to give scrutiny to that. Effective thinking is a necessary condition for successful decision making and subsequent decision development. So we're looking at that and saying, well, not only does the decision have to be sound, but the thinking behind the decision is being scrutinized also. That brings into question neuroplasticity. Some people may recognize what neuroplasticity is. It's the ability of you be able to cognitively rewire your brain to become a better problem solver. So where you were making decisions, or I should say where you were using judgment and choice and emotion to make decisions, I'm not even sure if I'd call them decisions, but to get through points of decision, neuroplasticity allows you to rewire your neural network in your brain to be a better thinker, be a better decision maker. So it makes your brain extremely resilient. It's a process by which you can change. You can undo learning and you can create new learning. You can be a better sports player, a better individual, better problem solver. Neuroplasticity also enables people to recover from strokes, injuries, birth abnormalities, and a variety of other things. It's really magnificent to think that you have this ability to be able to rewire your neural networks. You're not trapped anymore. So there's another book that's called You're Not Stuck with the Brain You're Born With, and also Softwired, how New Science and Brain Plasticity Can Change Your Life by Dr. Michael Merzenich. So these are available resources, and if we had more time, we would go through, do some exercises, and we would virtually rewire some of your neural patterns in some of the exercises that we would do, like 21 flags. And we would be able to demonstrate that you could actually do this in real time, in a short amount of time. And what happens here is that you rewire the neural patterns, but if you don't sustain the rewiring, it'll fall apart. So you have to keep reinforcing that pattern. That's why I say that become a good problem solver, a root cause facilitator, you have to practice it. It's a core competency that needs to be in the organization. So how about this? Here's a decision. Which way is the school bus going? Let me run this as a poll. Let me bring the poll up and we'll see how many people. Let me launch it. This is also my check to see how many people are actually paying attention. How many people have the screen on top? Because I can see the percentage of votes. So we got 82 people online. I see about 20% voted. By the way, any 5-year-old kid knows how to answer this question. I remember ran this at Rams a couple of years ago, and I had a PhD in the audience that was challenging me as to why he needed to know how to do this. And I told him, if you can't solve a problem that a 5-year-old could solve in 2 seconds, then maybe you should take a lesson here. So I got about 40% of people. Let me share the results with you. What we see is that some people say left, some people say right, but the vast majority of people, 30% of the audience, or 30 people, 68% of those voted, are saying it's not going anywhere. And then some people are saying, well, it depends on the country and which side of the road that you drive on. And in fact, a 5-year-old will solve this problem because a 5-year-old knows that in order to get on this bus, they have to go to the door. And they know if the door is not on this side, the door has to be on the other side. So it's simply a matter of them walking around the bus to find the door. And I don't care if it's in England or if it's here. Right side, left side, doesn't matter. The door's on the other side of that bus. And that's going to determine which way the bus is going. So in North America, the door would be on the other side of the bus here. How do you get that answer? Well, you have to walk around the bus, right? You have to change your perspective. And that's what we were talking about. We were talking about how to change that perspective. So what we want to do with every problem that we encounter is to be able to walk around that problem. We want to look at it from different perspectives to see if we can figure out where's the door. And you do that all the time. And of course, that drives my wife crazy because every time we go somewhere or do something, I'm always looking around. I'm always trying to gain that other vantage point. And she'll say, why can't you just enjoy being where you are, as a problem solver, you're sort of stuck. You're always identifying the problem. You're always looking to find the cause of it. And maybe that's just good practice, but once you rewire those neural patterns, that's where you end up. So it's an asset and it's also a caution, depending on whether you want to be that person. So let's move along. Three-tiered view. The mechanics, the chemistry, and the habits. So the mechanics are, the idea of working through the system, the prescriptive methodology that I'm going to give you to do evidence-based convergent problem solving called root cause analysis. Because there are two different types. There's divergent problems and convergent problems. And unfortunately, we don't have the time to talk about divergence. But what we can do is talk about the road sign that shows up immediately upon embarking on a divergent process, trying to use a convergent problem solving tool. What happens is the further we dig, the worse things get. Every time we take a step, we end up with another fork in the road. And that tells you from the mechanics side that you have now embarked on trying to solve a divergent problem with a convergent problem solving tool. It's not doable. It just gets worse and worse and worse. And then the chemistry. We have to take into consideration the emotions. One of the things that you'll discover if you start reading about neuroplasticity and decision-making and neurobiology is that no one has their arms around this idea of emotions. And emotions can sabotage decision-making. I once did a paper for a think tank. It was a workshop for Bill Bellows and the Aerojet Rocketdyne In-Thinking group there. Did a couple of days with them on, it was called Thinking, Metacognition, and Emotional Sabotage. And in there, I shared some of my personal experiences where I had done the dominant strategy, had laid it out, and then instead of executing the dominant strategy, I let my emotions overwhelm me and I did something else, which had a bad consequence. And that happens quite a bit. So nobody really has their arms around how to control that emotional sabotage. But to be aware of it is to say that I can challenge it when it shows up. And at least, if nothing else, I can stop the process and give myself enough time for my chemistry to change, because this chemistry can overwhelm the neurobiology of the brain. And then the habits. The vast majority of what we do is habitual. Thinking is habitual. So we need to take that in consideration. And if you're not sure about that, you could easily test it. Just take a little notepad, put it in your pocket, and then at certain times of the day, whenever you look at your watch or whenever you go for a cup of coffee or whenever you sit down, set it. Set some type of an event, and every time that event happens, pull that little notepad out of your pocket, write down what you were thinking, and write down why you were thinking about what you were thinking. You'll come to some really interesting conclusions as to how habitual your thought is. Here's Plato's chariot allegory. This is one of a number of allegories. What's really fascinating about this is that this came to awareness thousands of years ago. It's been around for a long time. But I think it's a nice allegory because what it says is that there are three elements to our brain. It's a triune brain. And so we have this rational, logical part, this charioteer who drives the chariot. And then we have this horse, the white horse, which is the behavioral horse. It's the one that behaves, it responds, it does what we tell it to do when we tell it to do it. But then we have the black, unruly one, which would we equate to the emotional side of us that tends to want to run where it wants to run. It doesn't yield to the word. It needs to be whipped in order to get it to go in the right direction. So here we have this thinking part, the frontal lobe of the brain, and then we have this rational, logical, neural patterns that we built that are sustainable and help us to move through our heuristics and biases. We also have this unruly horse that tends to want to run in any particular direction without being very responsive to logical, rational thought. So it's not a bad idea to keep that picture in mind so that when your emotions tend to erupt, at least you can recognize them as being a part of this triune brain. And we don't have a lot of time, so I don't put any more slides in here about the triune brain and how it came to evolve and how it's connected, other than to sense that it's awareness. So here we have some shifting gears. Problem well stated is half solved. I think everyone will agree to that. Common sense is a trap. People don't necessarily use intuition to the extent that we think that they would. and satisficing, fills most of the requirements, desires, vulnerable to groupthink. So we need to be careful about that. Which of these two go together? They got a monkey, a panda, and a banana. I got another poll here. Let me run that poll. Let's see what you think. So at this point, you're probably thinking this question is loaded to some degree. And when we train our facilitators, we go through exercise after exercise after exercise like this till we get them to the point where I ask them a simple question and they refuse to answer a simple question because they want to make sure that they understand all the elements of the question that I'm asking them. So I can ask them, what time is it? And they'll hesitate to answer that question. As a good problem solver, that's where you want to be. People put data on the table, they bring information to you, they make statements as if they were fact, and you're looking at them with a jaundiced eye, always questioning and always trying to walk around that bus to get another perspective. I've got 42% voted. Let me end the polling and let me share the results. What we see here is no surprise. We see that some people, probably a reasonable split here, 38%, 62%. A lot of people are looking at monkey banana and a lot more than they are looking at monkey panda. Monkey panda is categorization. And if you're a North American engineer and been trained in North American schools, then you like to put monkey and panda together because they're mammals, and so they're animals. They fit into a category, and we love to categorize things in North America or in the West, Western logic, Aristotle and syllogistic thinking. But in the Eastern tradition, the relationship is the monkey to the banana. It's an event. It's a relationship that they're looking at. So it's not unusual for the facilitator in a root cause problem solving scenario to find that you've got people arguing about the same thing. They're arguing panda, monkey, banana. When some people are arguing monkey, banana, some people are arguing panda, monkey. And it's the facilitator's responsibility to recognize this geography of thought, this cultural silo of thought having, and to be able to mitigate that and to be able to help to share with those people what is the common element that they're looking at. So moving to our slides, we've got this comparative analysis. This comes out of A New Way of Thinking, third edition by Dean Gannon, which was copyrighted in 2007. This is a comparison of root cause analysis tools and methods. And in here you can see that reality charting, of course, is a better way of doing just about everything. Causal mapping is evident. It's a methodology. And so we're looking at how good a tool is at doing this. And this will be in the slide set that you have so you can take a look at it. Some of these are really poor, like 5 whys and stuff. Some of them just don't do what we want it to do. And so what we're looking for is the best tool for attacking problem solving and doing causal analysis. And so I offer this to say that reality charting or Apollo root cause or solo logic or taproot are all basically using the same type of tool. We've got this Aristotelian syllogistic approach, which is Western logic, binary thinking, either or instead of both and. We got this cultural argument, especially in the West, status as a commodity, confirmation bias, conformity, correlation confused with causation. Everybody's looking at the problem from a different perspective. Let's talk about correlation for a second. Given a lower graph, vertical scale is tensile and strength, a T, and the horizontal scale is viscosity. So if I want higher tensile strength, what viscosity should I use? And most people would say, well, you use a higher viscosity. But that's causation. That's not correlation. And there's also another element here that to say if this was a stock trend, we would probably plot a line through here to say this is the trend. And we would ask, where do you think this stock is going to go? And most Western thinkers would say, well, we're going to extrapolate. We're going to say it's going to go up here along the line. But most Eastern thinkers, especially the Japanese, would say, no, it's time to deviate from this trend. And they would put the next point down here somewhere. You can see this significant demarcation in logic, or the way that we think. We want to take advantage of both of those. But let's talk about correlation a little bit. Here, highly correlated, you'll agree, right? This is a very highly correlated graph. And this is a correlation of letters and winning word of Scripps National Spelling Bee and the number of people killed by venomous spiders. There's no causation here. Here's another one. Per capita cheese consumption correlates highly with the number of people who died becoming tangled in their bed sheets. I mean, it's laughable, right? So when people show up with correlation, you need to question that immediately. When we're doing problem solving, we need to have a correlation matrix, but we're going to only use that to point us in a particular direction. We're not going to try to assume that any of it's causative. It helps us put us in north, south, east, west direction, but it's not going to be a assignable cause. And then we look about causation. If you look at Pearl's book on causation, causality, models, reasoning, and inference is the title of his book by Judea Pearl. We start to see this introduction of a new language. Now, this has been around for a long time, but it's being resurrected. So A correlates with B or B correlated with A. These are independent. And the new nomenclature for this is that A, independent of B, within the context of Z, shows that Z is the cause for both A and B. And we see this in the DAG, the directed acyclic graph. So when we start to do these acyclic graphs, we start to get an appreciation of here we have two independents, A and B, that cause C, and then C causes D. So we start to get this sense of connectivity where we can make better inferences about what's connected to what. This is a relatively in-depth book. If you're not familiar with probability and statistics, it's going to be a difficult read. So setting some criteria, let's say we're going to do this. If we want to be good problem solving and good root cause facilitators, and I say this only for convergent problem solving, causal attribution, for a well-crafted causal investigation, we'd like a problem statement evident, concise, revisited frequently. We want obvious causal paths of the greatest interest, prioritized by probability or likelihood. We want it to show us evidence for a supported decision. How was the decision made to either go down the path to the next cause or to support a decision? Terminated causal paths with decision evidence and support so we know why the causal path was ended. Actions taking or what's in progress. And desire to show the delivery dates and responsible person. And the resource agility, communication, and facilitation are culturally transnormative and contextually efficacious. In other words, it doesn't matter where I do it or how I do it. If I do it here, Brazil, Europe, China, it doesn't matter. It's transnormative. And so we've got an evidence-based analysis that basically says the prescriptive approach is to take a problem statement, ask what's caused by. We let the team make a claim, and then we're going to ask in that claim, what evidence do I need to substantiate or refute? And then we're going to say, who is going to be the person who's responsible to get that data? Other people are going to make other claims. Somebody may say it's a supplier. Somebody may say, no, it's the process. And so we're going to rank those with a priority, and the team's going to make that decision. So we're going to put a priority on these. And if the priority in the data that comes back says that, yes, there's a reason that this claim can be substantiated, then we'll go and we'll make other claims. And we're going to look at directly time-ordered data, coherent, homogeneous. This is our hierarchy of data that we're going to accept. And if we can't get direct time-ordered, coherent, homogeneous data, then we're going to look at indirect time-ordered, coherent, homogeneous data. If we can't get that, we'll take test data. It has to be statistically significant, 20 data points or more, multiple stimulus. In other words, it has to represent the environment that we're looking at and represented by stimulus. If we can't get that, we'll take historical, time-ordered, coherent, homogeneous data, and we'll filter down until we get to the point where we'll take aggregate data, NPRD data. In other words, a stake in the ground tells me I could go north, south, east, west, but it doesn't tell me much more than that. So given that, we may be able to get the data that we want up here, but we're going to make intelligent decisions about evidence-based analysis. And we're going to show the decision governance for that, and it'll be traceable. So as we move back, let me bring us to our trivial conclusion. Problem solving is a discipline, thinking is habitual, change that habit, walk around the bus every time, no matter how obvious, ask for deterministic data, anchor that, set the ground rules, opinions are dismissible by anyone. We want data, we don't want opinion, create a correlation matrix. This can be an indicator, and then plot, render the data in every way.